They were never meant to be discovered, hidden beneath grand estates, buried under open farmland, concealed behind walls thick enough to withstand military bombardment. Pablo Escobar's secret vaults were constructed to endure long after he was gone, and for many decades the majority of them did exactly that. But here is something the rumors never quite told you. Several of those vaults have finally been cracked open, and what the investigators uncovered inside was far more than just currency. It was a detailed blueprint, a living record of how a single man assembled the most devastating criminal empire the modern world has ever witnessed, and just how far he was prepared to go in order to shield it. This is the story of Escobar's hidden empire, and it begins long before the very first dollar was ever put into the ground. An empire constructed from absolutely nothing. Pablo Escobar did not come into power through inheritance. He forged it himself, rising out of the streets of Medellín through sheer ambition, deliberate brutality, and a sharp instinct for opportunity that most people never sharpen and almost nobody has the nerve to act upon. His earliest wrongdoings were almost unremarkable in how straightforward they were. As a young teenager in the late 1960s, he took tombstones from cemeteries scattered across Antioquia, had the inscriptions removed through sandblasting, then sold them back to grieving families who had no knowledge of where those stones had originally come from. It was a modest operation, utterly disrespectful, calculating, and carried out without a trace of guilt. People who knew him during those years would later describe a young man who displayed no emotional weight regarding the damage he left behind, a boy who had already disconnected himself from any sense of consequence. From that point forward, his offenses grew in a pattern that investigators and criminologists would later examine with great attention. Tombstones gave way to stolen vehicles, vehicle theft gave way to extortion, extortion gave way to abduction. By 1971, Escobar's crew had seized and ended the life of Medellín businessman Diego Echevarria, collecting a ransom of $50,000 before discarding the victim entirely. That act of violence was not simply a crime. That signal reached into every dark corner of Colombia's criminal world. Here was a man who never truly negotiated in good faith. He accepted what was offered, then removed whoever offered it. What lifted Escobar from being a street-level threat into something on an entirely different level was cocaine. Not the substance itself, but the enormous scale he recognized within it. At a time when almost nobody else could see it, by 1976, the trade routes were still taking shape. Distribution networks were unstable and poorly organized. American demand for cocaine was surging rapidly, yet the supply infrastructure to satisfy it had barely come together. Escobar read all of this with remarkable sharpness. That same year, he was caught moving 39 kilograms concealed inside a vehicle tire near Medellín. That arrest should have brought his career to a full stop. Instead, it turned into a valuable lesson. He paid his way out of custody. The officers responsible for bringing him in were later dealt with permanently. From that point on, Escobar lived by a personal code he would repeat openly for the remainder of his life. Plata o plomo, silver or lead, meaning the payment or the consequence. No middle ground existed. What gave this creed its real power wasn't only the menace it carried, it was how relentlessly and uniformly he put it into practice. Judges, politicians, senior police figures, military commanders, not one of them was considered off limits. Anthropologist Mary Rowland, who has written at considerable length about the social history of Antioquia, later characterized Escobar's corruption of public officials as systemic rather than simply opportunistic. He wasn't merely securing individual favors here and there. He was buying institutional loyalty wholesale, bending the machinery of the Colombian state into a shield protecting his own enterprise. Then in April of 1978, Escobar attended a gathering at a rural farm situated outside Medellín, alongside various other mid-ranking traffickers. That meeting is now regarded by historians of Colombian law enforcement as the moment the Medellín Cartel was formally born. Within just a few months, their combined network was moving around 19,000 kilograms of cocaine into the United States every single year. Within a few years, that figure would grow to something almost beyond imagination, the kind of weight that only unlimited money can produce. There is a number that comes up again and again whenever people talk about Escobar's wealth, and it is worth stopping on for a moment because it genuinely does not sink in the first time you encounter it. At the peak of his operation, the Medellín Cartel was pulling in an estimated $420 million every week. Not every year, every single week. His personal fortune, as estimated by various Colombian and American law enforcement bodies, fell somewhere between $30 billion and $60 billion, which works out to roughly $80 billion in today's money. Back in 1987, Forbes magazine included him on its annual billionaires list, putting his wealth at around $3 billion, a number that almost certainly fell short of what he truly held. He stayed on that list for 7 years running. At its height, the cartel was responsible for supplying around 80% of the world's entire cocaine supply. More than 15 tons were crossing into the United States each day alone, flowing through a logistics system that relied on fleets of planes, cargo vessels, and eventually specially constructed narco submarines built by hand in jungle workshops and capable of making transatlantic runs carrying enormous shipments. A later DEA review of Escobar's transportation network concluded it matched the operational complexity of a mid-sized international freight company, and he built his personal world to match that scale. His estate, Hacienda Nápoles, stretched across 7,000 acres in Antioquia. At its heart stood a grand colonial mansion surrounded by man-made lakes, a private airstrip, a bull ring, and a personal zoo filled with giraffes, elephants, and hippopotamuses that had been brought over from Africa. The hippos, famously impossible to relocate after Escobar met his end, went on to form a wild, self-sustaining population throughout Colombia's Magdalena River Basin, one that persists to this day and remains an ongoing challenge for wildlife biologists trying to manage the ecological fallout. In Medellín, he had an 8-story structure known as the Monaco Building constructed for his family, complete with swimming pools, a tennis court, reinforced security measures, and a dedicated panic room. Out on the Caribbean coast, he kept a heavily secured villa on Isla Grande, outfitted with a helicopter landing pad, windows resistant to gunfire, and private docking access. His collection of automobiles attracted considerable attention from investigators following his death. Among the vehicles cataloged were a Porsche 911 Carrera RSR that had once been raced by Formula One world champion Emerson Fittipaldi, a Harley-Davidson motorcycle that had previously been owned by Frank Sinatra, and the jet ski made famous in the 1977 James Bond film The Spy Who Loved Me. A number of these were later caught up in car bombings or confiscated by authorities, their charred remains put on display at Hacienda Nápoles as sobering reminders of his extraordinary excess. Yet the most telling detail about Escobar's fortune wasn't any particular item he owned. It was what became of the money he simply had no way to spend. His brother Roberto, who held the role of chief accountant for the cartel, later testified that the organization spent around $2,500 every single month on rubber bands alone, used purely to bundle the enormous volumes of incoming cash. He estimated that close to 10% of all stored currency, more than $2 billion each year, was lost to rats, dampness, flooding, and plain physical deterioration inside the warehouses and buried vaults where it was kept. In one recorded episode, during a stretch of time spent in hiding, Escobar burned through roughly $2 million in banknotes over the course of a single night, simply to keep his daughter from the cold. That detail has never been disputed. Multiple separate first-hand accounts corroborate this detail, and it was later verified by family members following his passing. In the most literal sense, money had become something meant to be thrown away. The architecture of concealment, the practical challenge Escobar was up against was one no banking system on earth could ever resolve. The volume of cash pouring through his operation was simply too enormous to clean at the rate it kept coming in. Banks had no capacity to absorb it. Legitimate businesses couldn't move it fast enough, and storing it in any visible or reachable form turned it into a target for rivals, for authorities, for enforcement agencies, and for the sprawling web of informants that surrounded him on all sides. His answer to this problem was structural. Across Antioquia and into surrounding regions, Escobar built concealment on a scale that authorities would spend the better part of several decades trying to fully chart. Cartel safe houses were transformed into reinforced hidden storage. Their interior walls were gutted and filled from floor to ceiling with stacked banknotes. Across farms throughout the area, sealed barrels were buried several meters below ground, many of them stuffed with bundled US dollars that would go untouched for years at a stretch. These properties were chosen precisely because they looked completely completely ordinary from the outside. Neighbors living nearby frequently had no inkling of what existed just beneath the surface under their feet. The hidden chambers themselves were a direct reflection of Escobar's deep-seated distrust. Heavy steel doors, reinforced concrete walls of remarkable thickness, interior spaces lined with lead sheeting designed to fool early, ground-penetrating radar technology, and entry points disguised to resemble ordinary storage areas or utility rooms. Separate construction crews were brought in for each section of the build, ensuring that no single contractor ever held a full picture of what was being constructed. What made this entire system so exceptionally hard to crack wasn't purely the physical engineering behind it. It was the human structure built around it. Escobar shared complete information with almost nobody. His accountants understood the financial flows, but were kept entirely in the dark about physical storage locations. His construction teams erected the chambers without ever knowing what those spaces were meant to hold. A tight inner circle of fewer than a dozen people, nearly all of them relatives, were the only ones who ever had a full picture of where the money truly sat. Roberto Escobar later spoke of a system of coded ledgers kept entirely apart from any formally traceable paperwork, in which the locations of vaults were noted in a private shorthand that only Pablo himself could read. When Escobar met his end in December of 1993, a great many of those codes vanished right along with him. The rumors that swirled around his various properties gave rise to a mythology that long outlived the man. Underground passages linking estates, hidden rooms dug beneath safe houses, escape routes tucked behind false walls. Some of those accounts came from law enforcement figures whose credibility was well documented. Others grew out of the wider climate of dread that Escobar had deliberately nurtured over the years. It was a world where a rumor could do the same work as a locked door. In Miami, the pink mansion he acquired on North Bay Road in Miami Beach became one of the most closely examined properties in that city's history after American authorities seized it in the middle of the 1980s. Investigators were firmly convinced that its walls were hiding concealed safes. In 2016, when new owners Christian Burrell and Jennifer Valey had the property torn down, the construction workers found precisely what everyone had suspected: thick concrete safes set directly into the foundation. One of those safes went missing before forensic teams ever had a chance to look at it, setting off an inquiry that was never brought to any clear resolution. A second was moved under armed guard to a bank in Florida. A sealed metal cylinder found underneath the kitchen stove turned out to contain nothing at all, though investigators never dismissed the possibility that whatever had been inside was taken out long before the building came down. Escobar's unraveling did not arrive in a single sharp, decisive instant. It built the way unseen pressure builds, quietly and steadily, and then suddenly, all at once. By the close of the 1980s, he had eliminated Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, cut down presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galan at a public rally in August of 1989, and arranged the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in a botched effort to eliminate Galan's successor, Cesar Gaviria. The aircraft went down carrying 107 people on board, among them 2 American nationals. Those deaths crossed a line that pulled Washington directly into the fight. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush authorized Operation Heavy Shadow, a secret American initiative designed to help Colombia dismantle the Medellín Cartel. As part of that effort, the military deployed Centra Spike, a specialized signals intelligence unit with expertise in intercepting communications and pinpointing the whereabouts of high-value targets. The unit had already seen action-tracking traffickers in Peru and Bolivia. Its arrival in Colombia, however, represented a meaningful step up in American involvement, one that stayed classified for many years. Centra Spike began picking up Escobar's calls almost right away, assembling a detailed acoustic profile that gave analysts the ability to identify his voice, his habits of communication, and the behavioral patterns that would eventually betray his position. By the time Escobar arranged his widely debated surrender in 1991, American operatives had already been listening in on him for close to 2 years. The surrender was a carefully calculated maneuver. He negotiated terms with the Colombian government under which he would serve no more than 5 years in exchange for avoiding extradition to the United States. Rather than being placed in a government-run facility, he was allowed to build his own prison, La Catedral, perched on a hilltop above Medellín. He personally handpicked his guards, drawing them from men who answered to him alone. The facility boasted a football pitch, a bar, a jacuzzi, a waterfall, private dining areas, and, according to accounts from both Colombian and American intelligence sources, a telescope pointed toward the city sprawling below. La Catedral was far less a prison than it was a fully operational command center, dressed up with a theatrical perimeter. From within those walls, Escobar kept running the cartel's affairs without interruption. Then in July of 1992, when the Colombian government finally moved to relocate him to a legitimate detention facility, following reports that he had arranged the brutal treatment and elimination of 4 associates inside the compound, he was already nowhere to be found. He had slipped out through a section of wall that had been built by deliberate design with purposely compromised concrete. By the time soldiers entered the structure, Escobar had melted into the mountain fog of the Andes, taking 9 of his men along with him. The escape was a humiliation for the Colombian government and extinguished whatever patience the United States had still been extending toward diplomatic channels. U.S. Ambassador Morris Busby, a former Navy officer and specialist in counterterrorism, called an emergency strategy session inside the embassy's steel-lined vault, gathering DEA Chief Joe Toft, CIA Station Chief Bill Wagner, and Major Steve Jacoby of Centra Spike. The conclusion everyone reached was the same. This pursuit was not going to end with handcuffs. The net was already drawing tighter. Colonel Hugo Martinez had been on Escobar's trail since the closing years of the 1980s. He had lived through attempts on his life, uncovered explosive devices planted beneath his own family's home, and been personally approached with a $6 million bribe through a mutual contact, an offer he declined without a moment's hesitation. By the time he returned from a temporary posting in Madrid toward the end of 1992, he came back sharpened and utterly focused. He reorganized the search block into a coordinated force of 600 men. Soldiers and police were trained side by side into a single-purpose strike unit. American backing fundamentally transformed the scale and capability of Martinez's entire operation. Centra Spike delivered real-time signals intelligence that Colombian forces had never had access to before. Delta Force operatives entered Bogotá under civilian cover in July of 1992, arriving just 2 days after Escobar's breakout from La Catedral. Their role on the ground was carefully framed to sidestep Colombian laws, barring foreign combat personnel from operating on national territory, officially functioning as advisors and trainers, while feeding intelligence that directly shaped raid planning. The manhunt steadily dismantled Escobar's network of support. Los Pepes perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, meaning those persecuted by Pablo Escobar, took shape as an extrajudicial force built from former allies who had become bitter enemies. Among their ranks were the widows of Fernando Galeano and William Monada, 2 cartel partners Escobar had ordered eliminated in 1992 following a falling out over money. Standing alongside them was Diego Murillo, known as Don Berna, a one-time Escobar lieutenant who had watched the man turn against his own circle and chose self-preservation over allegiance. Los Pepes targeted Escobar's properties, went after his associates, and delivered chilling messages by leaving remains in open public locations. Although American officials openly denounced their tactics, DEA agent Javier Pena later admitted in interviews that the group's campaign was arguably the single most effective pressure brought to bear against Escobar throughout the entire pursuit. They tore apart his infrastructure more rapidly than it could be restored and stripped away the sense of untouchability that had always anchored his psychological grip over others. Dolores Amadada Mona, the widow of a man Escobar had ordered killed, was brought to Washington under DEA protection and officially registered as informant AE 92053. Her knowledge of Escobar's finances, holdings, and inner circle was described by DEA analysts as among the most operationally valuable human intelligence the agency gathered across the full span of the operation. Her younger sibling, an MIT student with absolutely no ties to the cartel, had been taken and killed as payback for her willingness to cooperate. Following that, her resolve to see Escobar brought down was, in the words of one official who worked alongside her, complete and unshakable. Carlos Lear, once Escobar's high-profile partner in the Bahamas operation, sent a detailed written letter to the DEA from inside a U.S. federal prison. In it, he described Escobar's current whereabouts, his dependence on constantly rotating safe houses, his pattern of communicating through mobile phone networks in short and unpredictable bursts, and one physical detail that intelligence operatives found particularly valuable. Escobar was considerably overweight, in poor physical condition, and unable to cover any meaningful distance on foot with speed. The noose was tightening and the final hours were drawing near. By December of 1993, Escobar had spent more than 16 months on the run. He was shifting between rented properties, tucked inside Medellin's quiet residential neighborhoods, leaning on an ever-shrinking group of people he still trusted, all while sensing that the intelligence gathering closing in around him was something entirely different from anything he had previously encountered. On the 2nd of December, just one day following his 44th birthday, he placed the call that would bring everything to an end. He rang his son Juan Pablo and stayed on the line for an extended conversation, remaining connected far longer than any reasonable operational caution would have allowed. The call was intercepted by Centra Spike. Within a matter of hours, signal triangulation had narrowed his position down to a residential street in the Los Olivos neighborhood, an entirely ordinary middle-class district, so unremarkable and so close to the very city he had once dominated that the plainness of his chosen hiding spot was almost impossible to believe. Martinez's team moved on the address before the sun had risen. Inside a modest two-story row house, Escobar and his driver Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, known as El Limon, were present inside. One of the officers spotted a long-haired, bearded figure standing at an upstairs window. The man was heavier than any recent photo had indicated, yet the pursuit team had been tracking his voice for years. They knew the entire confrontation had lasted under 3 minutes. El Lemon made a dash toward a window, dropped onto a lower rooftop, and was brought down while trying to escape. Escobar followed just moments behind, carrying 2 handguns. One of them, the 6 Sauer, he had formerly handed over at La Catedral 2 years prior. He moved across the rooftops, exchanging fire, until 3 rounds found him. One hit his leg, another his back, and the third passed through his right ear. He was discovered a short time later, completely still on the clay tiles. The question of who had fired the shot that ended everything was never definitively resolved. Search Block Officer Hugo Aguilar stepped forward to claim credit. Don Berna maintained it had been his own brother. American conspiracy circles argued that a United States operative had been the one to pull the trigger, a claim that Centra Spike veterans have steadily pushed back against, though they admit they cannot fully account for every individual present near the scene during the closing moments of the operation. DEA agent Steve Murphy, who arrived on site and captured the first official photographs, documented a scene already compromised by the flood of officers, reporters, and onlookers who had poured onto the property before any forensic procedures could be put in place. A fresh forensic review conducted in 2020, drawing on ballistic gel reconstructions and updated wound analysis, gave weight to a theory originally put forward by journalist Mark Bowden, the author of Killing Pablo, widely regarded as the definitive chronicle of the pursuit. The fatal wound to the head, delivered by a 9mm handgun at extremely close range, displayed characteristics that did not line up with a shot fired from any meaningful distance. The weapon may well have been pressed right against his skull. Whether that weapon was held by a Colombian officer, a Los Pepes operative, or by Escobar himself has never been formally established. The official coroner's report ruled out self-infliction. That unusual choice to issue a denial through an unprompted press release before anyone had publicly raised the question struck a number of forensic pathologists at the time as exactly the sort of clarification that ends up generating more questions than answers. So what lies buried beneath the surface? Following Escobar's passing, Colombia set out to account for the enormous sums that had flowed through the cartel during its most active period. The outcome was sobering. Colombian officials have formally recovered roughly $75 million in assets connected to Escobar, a number that investigators broadly agree represents fewer than 10% of what was actually concealed. Back in 1989, photographs printed in Colombian newspapers showed $4 million uncovered inside buried barrels in Antioquia. The following year, $25 million was recovered, together with gold bars from a cartel storage facility. In 2009, $10 million turned up during renovation work at Hacienda Napoles after workers broke through a concrete floor and came upon a sealed chamber that had sat untouched for nearly 2 decades. Then in 2020, Escobar's nephew, Nicolas Escobar Jano, claimed to have retrieved $18 million from a residence in Medellín, guided as he told it by a vision. He described bundles of currency wrapped in plastic, found alongside a gold pen, a manual typewriter, and a satellite phone. Much of the money had been consumed by moisture and fungal growth over the years. He acknowledged that this was not the first such discovery he had made, and he chose not to reveal where any of the previous ones had occurred. In 2017, the Discovery Channel documentary series Finding Escobar's Millions brought former CIA operatives Doug Lowe and Ben Smith into Colombia, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, drones, and metal detection gear. Their investigation laid out in considerable detail just how sophisticated Escobar's methods of concealment truly were. Lead-lined safes, hidden floors, and vaulted chambers engineered to remain invisible to the standard scanning technology available during that era. One safe they uncovered turned out to hold nothing at all. The billions were never located. Near Antioquia, a local farmer dug up sealed drums packed with American currency so remarkably well preserved that investigators said the bills looked as though they had just come off the press. The legal question of rightful ownership, whether it belonged to the farmer, the Colombian government, or the survivors of cartel brutality, was never properly settled, and it sparked a debate around recovery policy that still continues in an adjusted form to this day. The most troubling conclusion reached by the researchers, investigators, and forensic accountants who have spent decades trying to trace Escobar's concealed fortune is a straightforward one. The greater part of it is most likely still out there somewhere, buried beneath fields, sealed behind concrete in properties that have changed owners several times over, sitting in hidden vaults under land no one has yet thought to look at. In certain cases, it is the rats and the mold that are still working on the money, what those vaults actually held. When Colombian authorities swept through Hacienda Nápoles and the web of connected safe houses in the early 1990s, they found precisely what everyone had anticipated: stacks of banknotes, sealed containers, the physical remnants of a cash-driven empire operating on an industrial scale. What caught them off guard, or perhaps what they had not fully braced themselves to face, was the paperwork. Tucked inside waterproof containers throughout the vaults were ledgers, careful handwritten records covering shipment timetables, payment rosters, and financial dealings, stretching from Colombia all the way to Miami and Madrid. Lists of bribes arranged by recipient, sum, and date. The names of politicians, judges, police commanders, and military officers who had been drawing from the cartel's funds, organized not by any moral distinction, but by their practical value to operations, the same way a legitimate business might categorize its suppliers. For prosecutors on both sides, in Colombia and the United States, these records were nothing short of remarkable. They confirmed through Escobar's own paperwork what investigators had long suspected, but found difficult to prove legally: that the corruption sustaining the cartel's operation was not simply a feature of its structure, it was the structure itself. Former associates and people connected to properties linked to Escobar also described rooms that never showed up in any official records, soundproof spaces equipped with drainage systems and metal hooks that served no real architectural function, nothing a legitimate building would ever call for. Investigators never formally verified the existence of interrogation or confinement chambers within the vault networks, but the physical accounts gathered from numerous independent sources across many years were consistent enough that Colombian law enforcement historians have come to treat them as credible. Escobar constructed his vaults to safeguard his fortune. What they ended up preserving was a record of everything that fortune had demanded. Pablo Escobar was brought down on a Medellín rooftop on the 2nd of December, 1993. Colombia took to the streets in celebration. The United States congratulated itself on how effectively its covert involvement had played out. And for a brief moment, the crushing weight of fear that had pressed down on an entire nation for nearly 2 decades seemed to finally lift. It did not vanish. The collapse of the Medellín Cartel created a vacuum that was filled almost immediately by the Cali Cartel. Already organized, already running, and already waiting for exactly this moment, Colombia's cocaine output barely slowed. The brutality that had been Escobar's tool simply became the tool of whoever stepped in next. What came to an end on that rooftop was not the wider conflict over drugs. What ended was one man's remarkable and suffocating hold over it, a man who had started out stealing tombstones and built, across fewer than 20 years, an empire so enormous that a considerable share of its wealth has never been recovered. Some of those vaults have since been opened. Most of them remain sealed. If you enjoy stories crafted like this one, thoroughly researched and well delivered, go ahead and subscribe. Then tap that notification bell. See you next time.